All right, we are ready for James chapter 2 in our survey through the New Testament. And hopefully you've read the chapter. Let's get a reminder of where we are, where we're going. The book deals with an active faith. Every chapter touches on an active faith. We're going to see that in chapter 2, as we did in chapter 1, chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5. All, some way, shape, form, or fashion touch on an active faith. And so that seems to be the predominant concept through the book. Last week we looked at James chapter 1. It dealt with trials and temptations. If you were not here and you're trying to keep up with chapter titles, trials and temptations, and we gave a key verse for chapter 1, which was what? Verse 3. All right, chapter 2 deals with faith and works. We're going to see how everything in that chapter laces in and relates to that concept of faith and works. That faith and action go hand in hand. Faith and works go hand in hand. Key verse would be verse 22, at least as I view it. Verse 22, do you see that faith working together with his works, and by works faith is made perfect or made complete. And so we're talking about faith and works. James chapter 2, key verse, verse 22. All right, here's what happens in James chapter 2. There are three things, and you could argue that verses 10 to 13 actually fit with 1 to 9, and we can make it two major points. And for if you're not in the Wednesday night class, you may not understand why we're saying it could go with as we group things together. But nonetheless, I divide this into three sections. And in verses 1 to 9, he talks about respect of persons does not harmonize with faith. This practice of showing respect of persons, showing partiality, doesn't harmonize with faith. That's his point. Now then, in verses 10 to 13, he talks about faith requires obedience to the whole law. That's an outgrowth of verses 8 and 9 of the previous section. Could be made a part of that section if we wanted to. Then verses 14 to 26, faith without works is dead. And so we talked last time about how that the book of James is often called the New Testament book of Proverbs, where there is a subject and then abruptly there's another subject and abruptly there's another subject. And that does happen in the book of James. But I think in this case, the three sections here fit together and all relate to faith being active and faith and works going hand in hand. You can't separate faith from works. You can't say, I have faith, but I'm going to behave any way I want to. Your actions have to agree with your faith. Make sense? That's the point of the chapter. All right, now let's get underway. We'll go to our questions first, and then we will get underway on flowing the chapter. In one sentence, what is this chapter about? I've already told you what I think. Maybe you've got it worded differently. All right, if you didn't catch what he said, that God doesn't allow you to pick and choose. God doesn't allow selective obedience. Good point. Anything else? Question 1. All right, true faith includes obedience and works. Very good, very good. I want to come back to question 2 after we get underway and start flowing here a little bit. Let's talk about respect of persons doesn't harmonize with faith. Now let's get verse 1. He said, brethren, do not hold the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, with partiality. Now, I know that I'm not going to translate that but in view of what we've been talking about in our Wednesday night class, but more of a paraphrase to get the gist of verse 1, he's saying you can't hold to faith and at the same time show partiality. Does that make sense? And so that's why I'm saying this section deals with respect of person doesn't harmonize with faith. Now here's what happens in this section. 4 things in this section. You can't have faith in respect of persons. We'll go back and get that at verse 1. And then we'll see that shows partiality, that disregards the poor, and it is a sin. So let's talk about verses 1 through 9, and then we'll come back to our questions. Again, let's go back to verse 1. You can't hold to faith and say I have faith and say that I have the kind of faith that pleases God and at the same time show partiality. Now, One of the reasons for that is God does not show partiality. Give me a passage or two that makes that point. God is not a respecter of persons, King James rendering, or does not show partiality. Romans 2:11. Let's get one more. All right. It is in Acts. Case of Cornelius. The first reference to Cornelius is in Acts 10. It's in that sermon. At verse 34, he begins the sermon saying, I perceive that God is no respecter of persons. Remember that? All right. So God doesn't show partiality, so you can't say I have faith in God and at the same time show partiality. Now let's go to verses 2 to 4. That is, showing respect of persons is showing partiality here. Let's see what he talks about. For if there should come into your assembly a man with gold rings and in fine apparel, and there should come in also a poor man in filthy clothes. Now let's talk about that before we talk about what you do with him. He pictures a scenario into your synagogue, some translations say, or into your assembly. It's really the idea. A man comes in with gold rings, suggesting there is some degree of wealth. Some writers suggest it may be a person of power that was manifested by the rings as per the time. In fine clothing, bright clothing, in other words, again showing some degree of wealth, in contrast to the poor man who has these filthy clothes. I don't know, that may suggest the idea that the clothes are dirty, but it more is the idea of cheap clothes. That he has on something cheaper that shows indeed he's poor, but this man is manifesting that he has some wealth. Now then, verse 3, you pay attention to the one wearing the fine clothes, and you say to him, you sat in the good place. Would suggest, whether justified or not, that in the synagogue, the place on the end that faced toward Jerusalem was the preferred seat. And the idea is that there are certain seats that are viewed as being prestigious seats in the synagogue. And so you may say to this visitor, you sat in the best of seats. We want you to have the best of seats because of who you are. You're obviously a person of wealth. Whether that's the case or not, whether it's at the end of that end of the synagogue, I'll leave that for you to search out for yourself. But you say to the poor man, what? Yeah, sit at my footstool. In other words, here's an inferior seat, or you sat off in that corner, you sat over there, you get back out of the way over there. And verse 4, have you not shown partiality among yourselves and become judges of evil thoughts? Now we'll get to verse 4 in a second, but what's going on in verses 2 and 3? All right.
Based on their outward appearance.
Yep.
Based on their outward appearance, not, they don't know anything about these two people. They don't know their background, they just are basing everything on what they see.
All right. They're showing favoritism based upon worldly grounds, upon external circumstances. And notice at verse 4, have you not shown partiality? That is, you showed distinctions. The English Standard, the American Standard, both will render that you make distinctions. You're distinguishing in people. What you're saying by making this action, that the rich is more important than the poor. Or maybe it's the educated more important than the uneducated, or whatever the case may be. One's more important than the other. The New Century translates that you are making some people more important than others. That's one of the little freer translations we talked about Wednesday night, but it gets the concept that you're making some people more important than others. You run to this rich man, you're more important. And so you said here, this poor man comes in, you sit off in the corner, and there's a seat if you can find one. Get over there and get out of the way and don't bother us, kind of thing. Now you make distinctions. Now at the end of verse 4, you become judges with evil thoughts. Did I ask a question about that? If I didn't, I should have. So here we go. What does that mean? Judges of evil thoughts.
Think of the rich and the poor man. The rich man must be a great person because he has a lot of money. The poor man is just some man that ain't got anything.
All right. Anybody have, some of you that's got your Bible apps, look up the Living Bible and raise your hand when you've got that. I want to look at that. It is the idea here at verse 4 that you're reasoning from selfish motives. Why would you rush to the rich man and give him the chief place? Yeah, he can do more for me than the poor man. The poor man may want something from me, but I really want something from the rich man. Does that you see the point? So here's someone who can do something for me. It may be power and influence, but he can do something for me instead of wealth. But here's somebody that can help me. You're reasoning from selfish motive. Anybody get the Living Bible? Yes, sir.
Does this discrimination show that your judgments are guided by evil motives?
Yeah, you're guided by the wrong motives. That's the point at the end of verse 4, that when you show partiality, when you make distinctions, you are showing you're judging by evil motives. You're making distinctions based on impure motives, selfish motives. Make sense?
I would even say they may not be looking for what he could do for them, but even what he could do for the church. Like they're looking for, I mean, you see that even today where people who can donate more, people who can have more influence, that wasn't necessarily their own personal thing that they wanted, but they thought that, because that's what a lot of people do, is they think, what's a good thing by helping the church by looking for this or doing this or hoarding these kind of people.
Good point. Good point.
Another thing, Don, that may be the only thing that person has. Comes into it. So you can't look down on it.
All right, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. All right, let's begin at verse 5. Showing respect to persons. You can't have faith and show respect to persons. What you're doing is showing favoritism, partiality. What you're doing, verses 5 to 7, is disregarding the poor. Now, it's interesting that at the beginning of verse 5, he said, "Listen, my beloved brethren." One translation, the CEV, says, "Pay attention, my beloved brethren." Or Phillips translates that, "takes notice." In other words, he's calling for a different mindset. So pay attention. You need to have a different way of thinking than what you're doing. So here's what he says. "Has God not chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, and which he has promised to those who loved him?" What is verse 5 saying? Absolutely. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 1, 1 Corinthians 2 make that point. That generally speaking, are there, let me back up before I say generally speaking, are there wealthy people, mega wealthy people who accept the gospel? Sure, I've known some mega wealthy people who've accepted the gospel. Are there some powerful, influential people that have accepted the gospel? Yes. But generally speaking, who accepts the gospel? The common man. And so it's often the poor, it's often those who have no influence, no power in the world. It's the common man that accepts it. The common people heard Jesus gladly, Mark 12:37. So it's the common people that generally that accept the gospel. With that in mind, he's saying, do you not understand, I'm going to paraphrase verse 5, that it's the poor people who may be rich, not in material things, but rich in faith, that God chose to be in his kingdom. So in other words, verse 5 says God chose them. But here's what you do, verse 6. Hey, what did he say? You have dishonored, you have degraded the poor man. In other words, your treatment of him, saying, here to the rich man, you come over here, and to the other man, you sit over there, you're saying to him that he is not worthy. You have degraded him. Now then, he reminds them in verses 6 and 7, what about the rich? Speaking in general terms, not all rich people, not all poor people fit this, but what is he saying in general terms, 6 and 7, 6b and 7? Yeah, in the case of the Jews oppressing them, or even the Romans for that matter, it's generally those in power and those with wealth that are the ones who are the oppressors. You're so impressed with wealth, it's usually those who have wealth who are oppressing you. So look at verse 6b. Do not the rich oppress you and drag you into the courts? In other words, their rulers were people who are wealthy and rich. You going to be impressed with riches? Are you impressed with those? No, we're not impressed. Do not they blaspheme that noble name by which you're called? The very people that you're rushing to and say, I want to give you the chief seat, are the very kind of people that have no use for the name Christian. They blaspheme that noble name by which you're. So rich men oppress you, you despise them, but God chose them. You're disregarding the poor. Now let's get verses 8 and 9. They go together. There's a contrast between 8 and 9. What's the point of verse 8?
Scriptures tell you how to treat others. You love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah, even the Old Testament, if you fulfill the royal law, it's interesting, he calls it the royal law, the law of the king, the law of our king. Remember he talked about the kingdom, verse 5? To play off the concept of the kingdom. Here's the royal law. The royal law says you shall love your neighbor as yourself. All right, I just learned something from that, as per the context. Showing partiality, finish my sentence. Well, it's a sin. But showing partiality in this context isn't a part of love, is in contrast to love. Does that make sense? So you're not showing true love toward that poor man. So if you have to obey the royal law, you do well. But here's a contrast. If you show partiality, that's in contrast, you do what? You commit sin and you're convicted and you've convicted by the law as you're a transgressor of the law. You sin. Make sense? So this is a serious matter. Now you stop and think about this. The person who's guilty of this may not be an adulterer. They may not be a fornicator. They may not be a drunkard. They may not be a thief. They may not be an idolater. Otherwise, they seem to be pretty good people. They just show favoritism towards certain classes of people. And we don't normally think of that as being so bad. But he labels it as sin. So how bad is that? We're about to learn verses 10 to 13. Questions or comments now before we leave that section? Yes, ma'am.
I think we all agree with that, but I know that sometimes Peter repeated that twice. He said, God is no respecter of opinions of persons, and then in Acts 15, when he was defending that, you see, I guess later on, when he was in a situation, Paul had to rebuke him.
Yeah.
Because he had not followed through on what he stated that he believed, and I guess at times he actually did believe it.
I think you're right.
I think sometimes we get in situations where we feel uncomfortable accepting people. There's so many people of both races here now. I have to remind myself, God created that person. That can be really hard.
Good point.
I think the golden rule could apply here.
Yes, sir. Here's the point. If you didn't catch all that Annie Lou said there, that she made an excellent comment, that Peter could preach the principle well, but he had a hard time practicing the principle. Did you get that? In Galatians 2, what she's talking about. She's referring to Galatians 2, where he acted as a hypocrite and withdrew himself when some came from James. Remember that? Even Barnabas was carried away. Even Barnabas was carried away with that, the text says. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to say, I think we can pretty much assume that this wasn't just this group's problem. I mean, when you even look at, we're looking at 1 John where he has to keep telling them, love one another, love one another. And, Paul had to talk about the certain, no, they don't have to be circumcised, you have to take these Gentiles in. It's hard for us, even in our, we think we're a diverse world or whatever, but to think about what these people, the mindset they had to change to be a Christian, to sit next to a Gentile or someone of another race, or that maybe you've grown up, being taught to hate or whatever else, that was a struggle for these mixed congregations all over.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let's go to question 2. Question 2. Let's make some application of this, as we already are doing. List some ways that we may be guilty of respect of persons or showing partiality today. One, be bad, but rich and poor, so we won't go over that. Yes, ma'am.
I was just thinking in the context, whenever someone walked into the assembly, whether they were Jew or it seems like there was an assumption that some action needed to be taken towards that person. It wasn't just let them walk in and nobody acknowledged that they were there, greet them, talk to them. Like they were treating them with partiality, but they were at least going to them. And like he can, maybe, I don't know if that's partiality, but
Good point. Good point. Question 2. What's your answer? Race would be one. We've already mentioned that. Where a person of a race that we prefer, whether we should or not, we may prefer that race, and someone of another race come and we kind of just ignore them, and so we're showing partiality. What other ways could we do that? Okay.
Someone from another nationality, another race, and we flock to them because you're all basically one.
Yeah.
So you pull them in with partiality because you want to show them diversity.
Right. That's happening in our world. Someone of education, someone of money, maybe even family. Do we ever show partiality toward family? That we're more welcoming of our own family, but if it's your family, it's a different story.
Sometimes we show partiality to those that have a reputation in the church. Like when I was in college, the children of well-known preachers, there was a certain distinction there. They got a little bit extra attention, whatever you want to say about that. So sometimes that, and that could be an issue too. We talked about, fallen preachers, and that can lead you astray. But that excitement to have, oh, so and so, or you're so and so's child, or whatever. There
Right.
is I don't know. There is a reputation.
Yeah.
within-
And sometimes it goes in the opposite direction. Because they're a child of a well-known preacher, they're singled out and targeted. That's why my kids didn't go.
One thing I think about whenever you hear, is what it's not saying is, it's not saying don't pay attention to the person that cuts in the tradition. It's saying to treat everyone the same.
Absolutely.
So, we're yo-yoing back and forth about those of the press. Everybody's in need of the gospel. All people are in need, whether or not they understand their dependence on their will instead of God. That's kind of what's the issue. All people who come into where our lives, we need to honor them the same and see that they have a need.
Good point. Good point. Let's look at verses 10 to 13 now. That 10 to 13 deals with faith requires obedience to the whole law. Now, this is an outgrowth of 8 and 9 because 8 and 9 had just said this showing partiality, showing favoritism is a sin. And and if you violate the law, you've committed sin. So now his point is, as an outgrowth of that, if you offend in one point, you're guilty of all. The law comes as a package deal. So let's get 10, 11, and 13, 10, 11, 12, and 13 together. Whoever keeps the whole law and stumble in one point, he's guilty of all. Now back up to verse 10, not verse 10, but verse 9. He is convicted by the law as transgressor. I think sometimes we think that here is the law and I'm violating this little part, but I'm obeying all the rest of it. And there is some truth to that. But what verse 10 is suggesting to us is that the law comes as a package deal. And when I violate this portion of that, it's the same as if I violated the whole law. I'm against the law. I'm going against the law as a package. Read again verse 10. Whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumble in one point, he's guilty of all. Now his evidence of that is this. Look at verse 11. One part's just as binding as the other. How does he approach that at verse 11?
Example of adultery and murder.
All right. Here's the law against adultery and the law against murder. What's his argument? Exactly. The same God that wrote the command, do not commit adultery, is the same God that wrote the command, do not commit murder. And if you're free of adultery, you say, I'm obeying that. I wouldn't think of that, but you commit murder, it's the same as if you committed all the sins. Does that make sense? Because the same God that wrote one wrote another. Now then, look at verse 12 and 13. We're going to be judged not by a portion of the law, but by so speak and so do. As those who will be judged by the law of liberty. The law that brings liberty, he said, you're going to be judged by that. But so speak and so do. Anybody have a translation that reads differently? Enhances our understanding. We talked about this on Wednesday night.
New Living Translation, so whatever you say or whatever you do, you will be judged by the law of sin free.
Yeah. Whatever you say or whatever you do, so speak and so do. However you talk and however you act, you understand that you're going to be judged. You live like you're going to be judged by the law of liberty. Do you think we always live by the code that I'm going to be judged by this law? I don't think we always do that. For judgment is without mercy on the one who has shown no mercy. Reckon what he's talking about. Think of context.
You're not going to show mercy to those that are around you, then God's not going to show mercy to you.
All right. Think he may be talking about verses 1 to 9? It's in the context, isn't it? When you show partiality and you toward the rich, are you disregarding the poor? Yeah, verse 6 says so. And if you're disregarding the poor, are you showing mercy to the poor? No. And so if you show judgment without mercy, then there's not going to be any mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. In other words, by showing mercy, we escape judgment. That's the point, I think. When I show mercy, then I'm escaping judgment. That's how it triumphs over judgment. Make sense? So what's his point? His point is faith requires obedience to the whole law. So this idea back at verse 1, you can't say I have faith. I have strong faith, but then I'm not going to obey that part of the law. I'm going to show partiality. You're guilty of violating the whole law because the law comes as a package deal. If you're offend in one point, you're guilty of all. One part is binding as the other. You're going to be judged by the whole law. Make sense? All right. Now let's go to the next section. Yes, ma'am. Okay.
It talks about people who come into our assembly, but people don't just accidentally come in usually today. They're invited usually. And if we look around us and people that we see around us are all like us, it may be because we're showing partiality before we come here. And we may be judging before we come here. I think that's something that we need to be aware of in our lives. Are we a diverse group of people who have lived a past and come here together, repentant of that past and willing to serve God in the new future?
Okay. All right. Good point. Let's look at verses 14 to 26. Faith without works is dead. How does this fit with what we've seen thus far? Or is this just an abrupt change in subjects? You've read ahead. You've read this section. We've just studied the previous two sections. How does this section fit, or does it fit?
If you're judging people and you don't have faith, and your faith is dead, and you're in congregation,
Yeah. Verses 14 to 26 deals with a general principle, I think, of which there could be specific application verses 1 to 9. Does that make sense? That faith and works go hand in hand. Is how I treat people, does that have anything to do with works? You bet that's everything to do with works. And my works have to harmonize with faith. Faith has to be active. Make sense? So he doesn't just abruptly make a change in subjects. Oh, by the way, let's talk about faith and works. We've been talking about partiality. Let's talk about something else. He's still talking about that. Does that make sense? I'm trying to get you to see how passages lace together. All right? With that in mind, here's what we're going to see about faith and works. Faith without works cannot save us. Faith without works cannot save because works are shown by our faith. Works show that we have faith. We'll see that at verse 18. And then we're going to look at examples of Abraham and Rahab and then the conclusions from that. So we've got time to get through this. This is a more familiar section, I suppose, for most of us than verses 1 to 13. So let's work our way through this. His point here is in 14 to 17 and 19 and 20, and I skip verse 18 because I'm going to put it elsewhere, is that this kind of faith cannot save. Now that's interesting that he starts on that note because he's just made the point in 8 and 9 that showing partiality is a sin. And that if you offend in one point, you're guilty of all 10 to 13. Make sense? You're going to face judgment. So, let's start at verse 14. What does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith, but he doesn't have works, can faith save him? I don't. No, the answer is no. But the point that underline that question, can faith save him? The question is not just can faith save. Other passages say faith saves, doesn't it? We're saved by faith, Romans 5:1, John 3:16, a host of other passages. What he's talking about is that kind of faith. It reminds me of the question in Matthew chapter 19 about a rich man entering the kingdom of heaven. The question is not can a rich man, the answer is yes. That rich man in Matthew 19 can enter. The one in the context. So can this kind of faith in the context save? And the answer is no, it doesn't save. Now he gives an illustration, verses 15 and 16. It's of no profit. What's his illustration? Absolutely. A verbal acknowledgement of something or verbal saying of something without any actions is of no value. And his illustration is you see somebody have need, brother or sister have need, and you say, go be warmed and filled. I hope that things go well for you. But you do nothing in action to take care of that. Words without action are worthless. So saying I have faith without action is worthless. Let's footnote here. Maybe you don't run into this as much, but we as elders go talk to somebody about their quitting serving the Lord, and they say, but I still have faith. I still love the Lord. What are they doing? Throwing out words without action. It's worthless. All right, let's get 15. We've got 15 and 16. Now, at verse 17 now and 20, here's why it's of no profit. Here's why it can't save, is because that kind of faith is dead. Look at verse 17. The faith by itself, it doesn't have works, is dead. The word death always means separation. Always. Something is separated from something else. So you have faith and works are separated. That means that faith is dead. It has nothing to make it alive. Look at verse 20. We're skipping down to verse 20. Do you not know, O foolish man, that faith without works is dead? It's inactive. It's worthless. Now, furthermore, verse 19. What's his point at verse 19? Yeah, but they're not acting, they're not obedient, are they? But even Satan recognized God. Job, for example, Job chapter 1. Remember Satan coming and talking to God about Job? That shows he believed in God. Even the devils believed and trembled. So that shows that faith by itself means nothing. It cannot save. It's of no profit. It's dead. Even the devils believe. Now let's go back and pick up verse 18. We skipped that. What's his point at verse 18? Yeah, absolutely. Faith is evidenced by your actions. You say, I have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without your works, and I'll show you my faith by my work. Someone said, I have faith. All right, show it to me. There's no way unless you show it by some action. So the point is that works show that we have faith. So one says, I have faith, but they're not doing anything. They're not obedient. That's not true. There's no true faith there at all. That's the point. Now let's get verses 19. We've already got verse 19. Let's start at verse 21. There are two examples that he gives. What's the point of the examples? Yeah, faith must have action for it to be acceptable. It's interesting that he mentions Abraham and Rahab. Quite a contrast of people. One writer suggests he picked some from the pinnacle of faith, Abraham, and some at the bottom of the moral rung, Rahab the harlot, and showed from one end to the other. Not saying that she wasn't a good person at the time she had faith. The point is that of all spectrums of people, here's some examples of faith being active. So let's look at those examples. What's the first thing he says about Abraham? Verse 21. All right, he believed in God. But what did he do? Verse 21. Yeah. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac his son on the altar? There was some action there. He didn't just say, well, now, yeah, I would be willing to do that, and I do love you, and I do believe in you, but he went through the action. So here is an example of faith. Now let's go ahead and get verse 23, because he mentions Abraham. The scripture said, Abraham believed God and it was counted unto him for righteousness, Genesis 15:6. And he was called the friend of God. What's that all about? It's when God said he would have a child, and he believed God, and it was credited to him for righteousness. So there was action that went along with that. Showed that he didn't just accept that, but he went along accepting the fact that there's actions along with his faith. Now, verse 25, let's look at Rahab. Then we're going to come back and look at 3 verses of the conclusion, and our time will be gone. What's the point about Rahab? Yeah. And she followed through with that action. Yeah, she was given instructions, and she followed through with the actions, and it was to credit to her that she indeed had faith. So likewise was not Rahab the harlot justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way. So here's 2 examples. Now, what conclusion, James, are we supposed to draw? Let's go to verse 22, then 24 and 26. Here's the conclusions he draws. He draws them at different times in the text, but let's pull them together. Verse 22, do you see that faith was working with his works, and that by works faith was made perfect? What does that mean? Had a question on that, didn't we? Yeah, question 6. What does it mean faith was made perfect? It was complete. Yeah, footnote may say complete in your translation. Let's drop down to verse 24. So that was the first conclusion he draws, that faith with works is now made complete. Verse 24, what's his conclusion? We're justified by works and not by faith only. Is faith important? Absolutely. But there has to be some obedience, some action, an active faith. Let's get one more conclusion. Verse 26. Just as the body without the spirit is dead, so then faith without works is dead also. What value is there of a body that doesn't have life, that doesn't have the spirit? So it's not going to do anything. That's where your faith is if it doesn't have works. Make sense?
Spirit needs the body needs the spirit.
Good point, good point.
You could do works, there's lots of people who do works but don't have faith.
Good point. Practical things, question number whatever that is, 8. Question number 8, practical things that you have learned from this chapter you take home with you. Faith and works. 3 things. What do you take home with you? Faith without works is dead. Good. Something else. All right. Must obey the whole law. Can't piecemeal.
I've heard so much from where I work and past jobs that people always say, I have faith, I believe in God. That's not enough.
Good point. Good point. What else? Take home with you.
All sin is equal.
All sin is equal. So you're saying my little sin is just as bad as his big sin? That's what the text said. That's what it told us today, wasn't it? Good point. One more. Show no partiality for whatever reason. Good point. We'll stop at that, James 3, next time.